This video comes from Wadellwebisodes. The title, Oil Painting Tip, Should You Blend? This is something that is quite tricky and it's often not very straightforward is the real problem. I find that depending on your skill level and how you're actually going to go through the blending process, that's going to have a major impact on actually determining whether or not it's appropriate to blend. So it's a little bit of a trick question, and there's many different ways to go about the blending process. So we'll see what Wadell has to offer here. I'll offer some of my own advice depending on what he brings up.
In recent times, I've perused YouTube and I've found entire videos dedicated to telling you that you shouldn't blend, you should never blend, it's bad, it'll make you a worse person. And I'm here to say, maybe. My process incorporates blending as one of its main key components, but I also see that there are certain problems with blending and certain concerns you need to be mindful of so that you can offset them or work around them and use blending in your process in a way that's effective and doesn't make your painting worse.
Yeah, so I mean, so far, a very good response here, and I like where he's going with this. It depends on how you use it. It needs to be worked into your process in a particular way to make sure you're not going to end up with muddy results. You're not going to end up just destroying some of the better qualities that you might already have.
First, I think it's important for me to share with you how I blend, the steps I follow, and how it fits into my oil painting process. And then that way we can talk about the concerns in the context of how it is I blend when painting.
He does have a process which is more suited for blending. He has more of the classical atelier type method. He's going for thinner paint, soft transitions, and you don't really find much impasto. Everything is pretty much going to be soft and you're blending out a lot. It's a little bit more on the photographic side. So I'll let him go through his process, and then I would like to add some points here if you're interested in a different way to blend.
Now, the way I blend is I take my brush, I wipe it clean on a paper towel, and I discreetly blend in that area where two brush strokes or two values overlap. I don't broadly blend the whole thing. I don't take a fan brush. I don't blend wholesale. I blend in small, discrete areas, again, where those brush strokes overlap.
The way he's doing it is a good way to approach blending if you're going to blend. But the other way that you could get that type of blending, and what I think is actually more effective, what leads more to liveliness, is that you blend through layering and through scraping or sanding. Now, it's quite similar to what he's describing. You're going to allow for that overlap, and that is absolutely crucial. Allowing for the overlap is very important for any of these blending techniques, because that is what ensures that you get a more even type of transition. If you don't have the overlap already there, then you could fall victim to just muddying it or going too far in one direction. But the main difference, and the thing that I like about sanding in particular, is that you're going to have a slight randomness going on. So as you start to scrape and you have that overlap, you're just going to be revealing particular parts of what's underneath there. So you're creating the transparency, and that is what actually blends them together or makes them appear like they're blended together, rather than just mixing together the oil paint itself.
Here I'm painting a sphere from imagination, and I'm working one piece of paint after the other, tiling them subtly so that they overlap, and then after I get a series of brush strokes in, I can go in and discreetly blend, wiping my brush clean so that I'm only blending in that small little area where those two pieces of paint overlap.
One of the keys here that I just thought about also is that it still allows for there to be a certain solidity and a simplified foundation. So you have kind of these bigger blocks, but the transitions are very soft. So this is a good technique. I mean, I can't imagine there's a better way to blend when it comes to just using your brush if you're not going to involve any kind of sanding or scraping, this is a very solid way to do it, because as he pointed out, he's putting them down like these individual shingles or these individual planes, and then he's just discreetly clearing out the line, essentially, the separation between the two. So you do get a good effect here, and this is something to consider when you're painting, is that you want to have this clear separation of values. We want to have a strong foundation and big planes to work with, so that way once you start to build on top of it, it still feels solid even once it becomes softer.
Let's talk about some of the concerns I've heard over the years about blending. One of the big concerns is that it can create generalized or very generic form.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, and that's why I pointed out the sort of separation that he's getting in the way that he described it, like putting down shingles. That is absolutely crucial, because he is allowing for those main foundational planes to still stay in place. So even though he softens the transitions, I'm sure he's going about this in a way where he simplifies, he gets the broader shapes, he allows those to remain solid, and then he just softens in the particular transitions where it makes sense.
I want my paint and I want the mixtures to respond to structural changes, so I can convey a zygomatic bone, the masseter, the nasolabial fold, any other structure in a very profound and meaningful way. So you want to individually mix as much paint and as many color shifts and structures as you can, and then blend those things together after you've realized the fullness of that structure and form.
Yeah, so basically he's painting directly. He's taking a somewhat direct approach, and then he just blends it afterwards. So that's not so different from what I think is a really good philosophy. The only thing that I would really do differently is to incorporate impasto and incorporate some kind of scraping, whether that's with a palette knife or with sandpaper. That scraping is going to lend itself really well to the direct techniques, and it's going to create this liveliness and slight randomness that you just can't get by blending with a brush.
I always talk about inhabiting that three-dimensional space, pretending you're sculpting, and you really want to think about that more than ever when you're blending, because the temptation can be to start to superficially smooth that paint out on the canvas so it looks nice and slick and pristine. And when you do that, and when you get too lured into that outcome, you can sometimes forget to think about that three-dimensional form.
Yeah, so he is, he's explaining this really well, and he has done a really good job, in my opinion, of maintaining this sort of sense of form while still blending out so softly. So I guess I'm not surprised per se that he actually does it in this way, because this is really the only way that you can achieve this great sense of volume and form. And whether you're using very soft techniques like this or you're using more rough and loose techniques, you have to have that, and you need that foundation there. So pretty much the core of all these problems, all the problems that people would have with blending in general, are solved if you just focus on the big shapes, the big planes, and you paint directly, and you get things to feel really solid, you allow for some separation, and then you're able to blend on top of that. So I think that's one of the main reasons why blending really gets a bad rap. A lot of times it's more geared towards those beginners that you don't want to do any kind of blending, because that can just make it easy to fall into these typical traps. But if you're conscientious about it and you go through the process like how he's doing it here, then it's not a bad idea. I mean, you could definitely use blending to your advantage. I don't think that this is really the way to achieve the most lively results. I think you need to do some more on top of this, but this would be feasible as long as you're conscientious and you're paying attention to the broader shapes.
And when you blend, and you blend over too broad of an area, you can completely dilute that color effect or those color relationships that you worked so hard to achieve. So again, you don't want to blend over too large of an area, and you want to be very mindful of what you're blending and how, in a very controlled manner, to avoid smearing out the chroma that you worked so hard to achieve, or that delicate balance of hue.
Yeah, so that's a really good point there. He's actually paying attention, and he knows where to leave the separation, which is just absolutely crucial. That's the real difference maker here, is where do you leave things separated. It's not just about values, it's also about color, as you pointed out. Some areas are going to have a little bit more of that local temperature shift. Areas like the eyes, nose, and mouth, I'm always talking about that. And in those areas, you need to have a little bit of that separation so we can really distinguish between, you know, even the lip and the skin that's right underneath it. You need to have a shift there to make it feel real. You're not going to get that if you just blend over very broad areas without paying attention to where you need those separations. Yeah, so that's a good explanation from him. I think this really just comes down to the bigger problem here, which is what kind of foundation do you have? Are you laying in the big shapes, the big forms? Are you getting the planes, everything like that in place and allowing them to remain solid and on their own when necessary, so that way you don't fall into any of these problems. And this applies to any method that you really follow. No matter what you're trying to achieve, this is going to be necessary to pay attention to. So that was a good explanation overall. I like how we talked about the shingles in particular. I think that's a really good way to think about this and how to think about the way you're layering your paint. You need to have some of that overlap as he described. If you're interested in more in-depth lessons about how to build up layers and trying to look for that Rembrandt-esque type layering process, feel free to check out my Patreon. If there's any videos you would like me to react to, any videos you'd like me to make or demonstrate anything, feel free to leave that in the comment section. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.